The golden gates of Buckingham Palace have witnessed centuries of royal ceremonies, diplomatic meetings, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. But on one ordinary Tuesday morning, those same walls that had protected monarchs and preserved state secrets would echo with something far more urgent than political discussions or ceremonial duties. Behind the ornate doors and down the marble corridors, a sound that should never be heard in such hallowed halls would pierce through the morning silence, the desperate cry of a child in distress. What began as a routine security patrol would soon uncover a situation that threatened not just the carefully maintained image of the royal household, but the safety of an innocent life. The guard who made the decision to force open that door had no idea that his actions would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything the palace stood for, expose hidden truths about those trusted with the highest responsibilities, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in war rooms or parliament halls, but in the quiet moments when one person chooses to act on behalf of another who cannot protect themselves. This is the story of courage, corruption, and the price of speaking truth to power, even when that power wears a crown. James Mitchell had been walking the same corridors of Buckingham Palace for 12 years, his footsteps echoing softly against the polished marble floors as he completed his morning security rounds. At 45, he had seen 3 different monarchs, countless state visits, and enough royal drama to fill several newspapers, though his oath of confidentiality meant those stories would never see the light of day. Today felt like any other Tuesday morning in March, with thin London sunlight filtering through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the ornate hallways. The palace was stirring to life around him. Kitchen staff had been working since 4 in the morning, preparing breakfast for the royal family and their guests. Administrative assistants were already at their desks, sorting through correspondence that arrived daily from around the world. Gardeners tended to the meticulously maintained grounds outside, ensuring every hedge was perfectly trimmed and every flower bed was arranged to royal standards. It was a world of precision and protocol, where every detail mattered and nothing was left to chance. James took his responsibilities seriously. Unlike some of the younger guards who saw their positions as stepping stones to bigger careers in private security or law enforcement, he genuinely believed in protecting the institution he served. His father had been a palace guard before him, and his grandfather had served during World War II when the royal family refused to leave London despite the bombing raids. Service to the crown was not just a job for the Mitchell family. It was a calling that connected them to something larger than themselves. The East Wing was always quiet at this hour. Most of the royal family's private quarters were located in other parts of the vast building, leaving this section primarily for staff offices and storage rooms. James knew every door, every window, and every potential security risk in his assigned area. He could walk his route with his eyes closed and still notice if anything was out of place. That attention to detail had served him well over the years, earning him commendations from his supervisors and the trust of his colleagues. As he approached the corridor that housed several administrative offices, something made him pause. It was not unusual for staff members to arrive early, especially during busy periods when royal engagements required extra preparation. However, the sound he heard was different from the typical morning bustle. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the distant sounds of kitchen activity and maintenance work. But as James stood still and listened carefully, he realized what he was hearing made his blood run cold. It was the sound of a child crying. The sound was coming from behind one of the office doors about halfway down the corridor. James knew that particular office belonged to Margaret Thornfield, a senior administrative assistant who had worked at the palace for nearly 20 years. She handled correspondence for several minor members of the royal family and coordinated various charitable events throughout the year. Margaret was known for her efficiency and discretion, qualities that made her invaluable in an environment where privacy was paramount. But Margaret did not have children. In fact, James remembered from conversations with other staff members that she had never married and lived alone in a small flat not far from the palace. She was dedicated to her work to the point where some colleagues joked that the palace was her only family. So why would there be a child in her office at 7:30 in the morning? James approached the door slowly, his training kicking in as he evaluated the situation. The crying had stopped for a moment, but then it resumed, more intense than before. It was definitely a young child, probably no more than 5 or 6 years old, based on the pitch and volume of the distress. The sound was not the normal fussing of a tired or hungry child, but the desperate wailing of someone who was genuinely frightened or in pain. He knocked on the door gently, calling out in his most professional voice, "Thornfield, this is security. Is everything all right in there?" There was immediate silence from behind the door, as if whoever was inside was holding their breath. James waited for a response, counting the seconds as they stretched into what felt like minutes. Then he heard movement inside the office, the scraping of furniture being moved and what sounded like hushed, urgent whispers. "Miss Thornfield," he called again, louder this time. "I need you to open the door, please." The response came in Margaret's voice, but it sounded strained and nervous in a way that James had never heard before.
"Everything is fine, Mr. Pregel."
"Mitchell, I am just dealing with some paperwork. Please continue with your rounds." But everything was clearly not fine. The child had started crying again, and this time James could hear what sounded like someone trying to muffle the sound. His protective instincts, honed by years of training and experience, told him that whatever was happening behind that door required immediate intervention. He had seen enough domestic situations during his time in the military before joining the palace staff to recognize the signs of someone in genuine distress. James tried the door handle and found it locked, which was unusual for that time of morning when most staff members kept their offices open for easy access. He knocked again, more firmly this time, and announced his intention to enter if the door was not opened voluntarily. The crying intensified, and James could now distinctly hear a small voice calling out for help, though the words were muffled and difficult to understand. In that moment, James faced a decision that would change everything. Palace protocol was clear about respecting the privacy of staff members and avoiding unnecessary interference in personal matters. However, his duty to protect and serve extended beyond the royal family to everyone under the palace roof. More importantly, his conscience as a human being would not allow him to walk away from a child who was clearly in distress. James pulled out his radio and contacted the Central Security Office, reporting the situation and requesting backup. Then, without waiting for further instructions, he stepped back and prepared to force the door open. He had done this before during training exercises, and he knew exactly how much force would be required to break through the standard office door locks used throughout the palace. The door gave way on his second attempt, swinging open to reveal a scene that would haunt James Mitchell for the rest of his life. Margaret Thornfield was standing near her desk, her usually neat appearance disheveled and her face flushed with panic. But what captured James's immediate attention was the small figure huddled in the corner behind Margaret's chair, a little girl, probably around 5 years old, with tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks and her clothes torn and dirty. The child looked up at James with eyes that held a mixture of hope and terror, as if she could not decide whether this new person represented rescue or further danger. Margaret began speaking rapidly, trying to explain the situation, but James was focused entirely on the little girl. She was thin, obviously undernourished, and bore what appeared to be fresh bruises on her arms and legs. Her hair was matted and unkempt, and she was shivering despite the warmth of the office. "It's going to be okay," James said softly, kneeling down to the child's level and speaking in the gentle tone he reserved for his own nieces and nephews. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The little girl looked at him for a long moment before whispering, "Emily. I want to go home." Those 4 words would echo in James Mitchell's mind for years to come, because as he would soon learn, Emily had no home to go to. She had been living in the shadows of one of the most famous buildings in the world, invisible to everyone except the person who was supposed to be caring for her. And that person, as James was about to discover, had been failing in that responsibility in ways that defied belief. As backup security arrived and Margaret Thornfield began her explanation, James realized that his routine Tuesday morning had just become anything but routine. He had uncovered something that would challenge not only his understanding of the people he worked with daily, but also his faith in the institution he had served so faithfully for more than a decade. The sound of Emily's crying had led him to this moment, and now there was no turning back. Whatever came next, James knew that the little girl's welfare had to come first, regardless of the consequences for himself or anyone else involved. In the coming days, he would learn just how high those consequences could be when someone dared to prioritize human compassion over institutional loyalty. As Emily was gently coaxed out from behind the chair and wrapped in James's security jacket, the first chapter of a story that would shake the palace to its very foundations had begun. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the tall windows, but everything else about James Mitchell's world had changed forever. The emergency response that followed James Mitchell's discovery moved with the precision and discretion that only the palace staff could muster. Within minutes, the corridor was secured, additional security personnel arrived to seal off the area, and senior administrative officials were notified of the situation. However, what appeared to be a smoothly orchestrated response masked an undercurrent of panic that was spreading through the upper levels of palace management. Emily sat in the palace medical facility, a small but well-equipped room typically used for treating minor injuries sustained by staff members during their duties. Dr. Sarah Whitmore, the palace physician, conducted a thorough examination while trying to make the frightened child feel as comfortable as possible. The results of her medical assessment would later become crucial evidence that in those first hours, Dr. Whitmore focused entirely on Emily's immediate needs. The child was severely malnourished, weighing almost 20 pounds less than she should for her age. She showed signs of prolonged neglect, including dental problems that indicated she had not received proper medical care for months. Most disturbing were the multiple bruises and marks on her body that were consistent with physical abuse. Some were fresh, probably sustained within the past few days, while others had faded to yellow and green, suggesting a pattern of ongoing mistreatment. Emily spoke very little during the examination, responding only to direct questions and then only in whispers. She seemed particularly frightened when anyone approached her quickly or made sudden movements. Dr. Whitmore noted in her report that the child exhibited classic symptoms of trauma, including hypervigilance and an exaggerated startle response. When asked about her family, Emily would only say that Margaret was taking care of her and that her real mummy was gone. Meanwhile, Margaret Thornfield sat in a conference room 3 floors above, facing a panel of senior palace officials who were trying to understand how this situation had developed under their noses. Margaret's story emerged slowly, and with each detail, the enormity of the scandal became more apparent to everyone involved. Emily was Margaret's great-niece, the daughter of Margaret's nephew who had struggled with drug addiction for several years. Emily's mother had died of an overdose 8 months earlier, and her father had been in and out of rehabilitation centers, leaving the child with no stable home. Rather than involving social services, Margaret had convinced herself that she could provide Emily with a better life by bringing her to live at the palace. What had started as a temporary arrangement had gradually evolved into something far more complex and dangerous. Margaret had been keeping Emily hidden in various unused rooms throughout the palace, moving her frequently to avoid detection. The child had been living like a ghost in one of the most closely monitored buildings in the world, subsisting on food that Margaret smuggled from the staff dining facilities and sleeping on makeshift beds created from storage room supplies. Margaret's motivation seemed to be a mixture of genuine care for her great-niece and a complete inability to understand the reality of her situation. She insisted that she was protecting Emily from a broken social services system that would have placed the child in foster care. She believed that providing Emily with shelter and food, even under these circumstances, was better than any alternative the government could offer. However, Margaret's ability to care for Emily was severely limited by her need to maintain her cover story and continue performing her duties as a palace staff member. She could not take Emily to a doctor when the child became ill, could not enroll her in school, and could not provide the stable, nurturing environment that any 5-year-old needed to thrive. Instead, Emily had spent months living in shadows, hidden away from the world and dependent entirely on Margaret's increasingly erratic care. The physical evidence of neglect and abuse told a different story than Margaret's claims of protection and love. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed that Emily had been locked in small spaces for extended periods, given inadequate food and water, and subjected to physical punishment when she cried or made noise that might attract attention. The bruises on her body were consistent with being grabbed roughly and shaken, and there were marks on her wrists that suggested she had been restrained. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about how Margaret had managed to keep Emily hidden for so long. She had used her knowledge of palace schedules and security protocols to move the child around the building, always staying one step ahead of cleaning crews, maintenance workers, and other staff members who might stumble upon their secret. Emily had become an expert at staying quiet and hiding at a moment's notice, skills that no child should ever need to develop. The palace officials faced an immediate crisis that went far beyond the obvious concerns about Emily's welfare. The security implications of having an unaccounted-for person living in the palace for months were staggering. Every protocol had been compromised, and every assumption about the building's security had been proven false. If Margaret could hide a child in the palace for 8 months, what else might be going undetected? More troubling was the realization that other staff members must have been aware that something unusual was happening. Food had been disappearing from storage areas in quantities that exceeded normal usage. Cleaning supplies had gone missing from utility rooms. There had been reports of strange sounds in empty parts of the building that had been dismissed as settling or small animals. The signs had been there, but no one had connected them or taken them seriously enough to investigate further. The palace's head of security, Commander Robert Hayes, found himself in the unprecedented position of having to explain to his superiors how such a massive security breach could have occurred on his watch. Hayes had been with the palace for 15 years and had overseen security during several high-profile events, including state visits and royal weddings. His reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail was now being questioned by everyone from junior staff members to members of the royal household itself. The immediate priority was Emily's safety and well-being, but the broader implications of the situation were becoming clear to everyone involved. This was not just a case of one employee making poor personal decisions. It was a systemic failure that called into question the palace's ability to protect itself and the people it housed. The protocols that everyone had trusted to keep them safe had been proven inadequate, and the consequences of that failure extended far beyond Margaret Thornfield's office. As news of the incident began to spread through the palace staff, rumors and speculation started to fill the information vacuum left by official silence. Some staff members expressed shock and disbelief that such a thing could happen in their workplace. Others admitted that they had suspected something was amiss but had not known how to voice their concerns or to whom they should report them. A few confessed to having seen Emily briefly, but had assumed she was a relative visiting for a short period. The investigation team, led by Commander Hayes and including representatives from the palace administration, security, and legal departments, worked through the night to piece together a complete timeline of events. They interviewed dozens of staff members, reviewed security footage from multiple areas of the palace, and examined physical evidence from the various locations where Emily had been hidden over the past 8 months. What emerged was a picture of an institution so focused on maintaining its public image and preserving its traditions that it had lost sight of its fundamental responsibility to protect the vulnerable people within its walls. The elaborate systems designed to keep outsiders from getting in had failed completely when it came to monitoring what was happening inside. The protocols that governed every aspect of palace life had created blind spots where a child could suffer in silence for months without anyone taking effective action to help her. Emily spent her first night in proper care at a private medical facility, under the watchful eye of social services representatives who had been called in to assess her situation and determine the best course of action for her future. She slept in a real bed for the first time in months, with regular meals and medical attention available whenever she needed them. But the trauma of her experiences would not be so easily healed, and the questions surrounding how she had ended up in such circumstances were far from answered. For James Mitchell, the guard whose decision to force open that door had set everything in motion, the night brought little rest. He found himself replaying every detail of the morning's events, wondering what other signs he might have missed and whether he could have discovered Emily's situation sooner. The image of her frightened face would stay with him for years to come, a reminder of the importance of listening to his instincts and acting on behalf of those who could not protect themselves. The palace that had seemed so secure and orderly just 24 hours earlier now felt like a place where anything could happen, and probably had. As dawn broke over London, the beginning of the second day of what would become known internally as the Emily incident, everyone involved knew that their world had changed forever. The question was no longer what had happened, but what would be done about it, and who would be held accountable for allowing it to continue for so long. The third day of the investigation brought with it a revelation that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of palace administration. As investigators continued to piece together the timeline of Emily's hidden existence within the palace walls, they uncovered evidence that Margaret Thornfield had not been acting alone. The conspiracy, as it was now being called in hushed conversations throughout the building, involved a network of staff members who had been complicit in keeping Emily's presence secret. Detective Inspector Caroline Walsh from the Metropolitan Police had been discreetly brought in to lead the criminal investigation, working alongside palace security to ensure that all potential legal violations were properly documented and addressed. Walsh was a veteran investigator with 25 years of experience in cases involving child welfare and institutional abuse. She had seen similar situations in schools, care homes, and religious institutions, but never in a setting as prestigious and supposedly well-regulated as Buckingham Palace. The evidence that emerged painted a disturbing picture of willful blindness and misguided loyalty among certain palace staff members. At least 6 employees had known about Emily's presence and had actively participated in concealing her from authorities. This included a kitchen worker who had been providing extra food rations, a maintenance supervisor who had disabled security cameras in certain areas during specific time periods, and 2 cleaning staff members who had altered their schedules to avoid encounters with Margaret and Emily. Each of these individuals had their own justification for their involvement. Thomas Bradley, the kitchen worker, claimed he believed Emily was a temporary guest whose presence needed to be kept quiet for security reasons. He had been told by Margaret that the child was the daughter of a foreign diplomat who was staying at the palace under special protection arrangements. The story seemed plausible enough in an environment where unusual security measures were commonplace, and Thomas had not questioned it further. Sandra Lewis, one of the cleaning staff members involved, had a different explanation. She had discovered Emily during one of her shifts 3 months earlier and had been told by Margaret that the child was her great-niece who was staying temporarily while family issues were resolved. Sandra's own experience with social services, which had removed her children from her care during a difficult period in her life, made her sympathetic to Margaret's claims about protecting Emily from an inadequate system. The maintenance supervisor, David Morrison, had been convinced that he was helping to maintain operational security by ensuring that Emily's presence did not interfere with normal palace functions. Margaret had told him that Emily was part of a classified security exercise designed to test the palace's ability to detect unauthorized persons. Morrison's background in military intelligence made him comfortable with compartmentalized information and need-to-know protocols, so he had not questioned the unusual nature of the request. Each explanation revealed the sophisticated manipulation that Margaret had employed to secure cooperation from her colleagues. She had crafted different stories for different people, always playing to their individual vulnerabilities and pre-existing beliefs. She had exploited their trust in her as a long-serving and respected member of the palace staff, and she had taken advantage of their conditioning to follow orders and maintain confidentiality without asking too many questions. Detective Inspector Walsh recognized these tactics from other institutional abuse cases she had investigated. Perpetrators often succeeded by creating a culture of secrecy and compliance among potential witnesses, convincing them that they were part of something important or necessary rather than something harmful. The palace environment, with its emphasis on discretion and unquestioning loyalty, had provided the perfect conditions for this type of manipulation to flourish. As the investigation deepened, more troubling details emerged about Emily's daily existence within the palace. She had been kept in a rotation of hiding places throughout the building, including unused storage rooms, abandoned staff quarters, and even, on one occasion, a space behind the kitchen's industrial refrigeration units. Each location had been carefully chosen to minimize the risk of discovery while providing basic shelter and concealment. Emily's daily routine had been strictly regimented to coincide with the palace's operational schedules. She would be moved from location to location based on when different areas would be occupied by staff or visitors. She learned to recognize the sounds of approaching footsteps and to hide immediately when anyone came near her current hiding place. She had been trained to remain silent for hours at a time, even when hungry, thirsty, or in need of a bathroom. The psychological impact of this existence was evident in Emily's behavior during her interviews with child psychologist Dr. Rebecca Chen, who had been brought in to assess her mental state and help her begin processing her experiences. Emily exhibited symptoms consistent with complex trauma, including difficulty trusting adults, hypervigilance, and regression to behaviors typical of much younger children. She had trouble sleeping alone and would panic when placed in small enclosed spaces. Dr. Chen's preliminary report described Emily as a child who had been forced to develop survival mechanisms that no human being should ever need. She had learned to suppress her natural needs for attention, affection, and social interaction in order to remain hidden. She had developed an acute sensitivity to danger signals and could instantly shift from normal childhood behavior to complete stillness and silence. These adaptations had helped her survive in an impossible situation, but they would require extensive therapy to overcome. The investigation also revealed the financial aspects of Margaret's scheme. She had been systematically stealing supplies and resources from the palace to support Emily's basic needs. This included food from the kitchens, blankets and pillows from storage areas, and even small amounts of money from petty cash funds to purchase items like children's clothing and medicines. The total value of the stolen goods was relatively modest, but the violation of trust was enormous. More seriously, Margaret had been falsifying official records to cover her tracks. She had altered inventory reports to account for missing supplies, modified duty rosters to create opportunities for moving Emily undetected, and even forged documents to justify her presence in restricted areas of the palace. These actions constituted multiple criminal offenses and demonstrated a level of premeditation that contradicted her claims of acting impulsively to protect her great-niece. The palace administration found itself facing a crisis that threatened not only individual careers, but the institution's entire reputation for competence and reliability. The Queen's private secretary, Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, convened emergency meetings with senior staff to discuss how to manage the situation while protecting both Emily's privacy and the palace's public image. These discussions revealed deep disagreements about how much information should be shared with law enforcement and whether certain aspects of the case could be handled internally. Sir Geoffrey had served the royal family for 30 years and had managed countless crises, from personal scandals involving minor royals to security breaches during state visits. However, this situation was unlike anything he had encountered before. It combined criminal activity, child welfare concerns, security failures, and potential public relations disasters in a way that defied any standard crisis management approach. The pressure to contain the scandal was enormous, but it was increasingly clear that the situation had grown beyond the palace's ability to manage internally. Detective Inspector Walsh had made it clear that this was now a formal criminal investigation that would follow standard procedures regardless of the institutional preferences of those involved. Social services had also asserted their authority over Emily's case, insisting that her welfare took precedence over any other considerations. James Mitchell found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position as the investigation continued. His heroic action in discovering Emily had initially been praised by his superiors, but as the scope of the conspiracy became apparent, some officials began to question whether he had acted too hastily in forcing open Margaret's door. There were suggestions that a more diplomatic approach might have allowed for a quieter resolution that would have been less disruptive to palace operations. These criticisms revealed a troubling institutional mindset that prioritized maintaining appearances over protecting vulnerable individuals. James began to understand that his decision to put Emily's welfare first had challenged not just specific individuals, but an entire culture that valued discretion and stability above all else. He realized that some of his colleagues viewed his actions as a betrayal of the unwritten code that governed palace life. The strain of being at the center of such a controversial investigation was taking its toll on James personally. He had trouble sleeping and found himself constantly replaying the events of that Tuesday morning, wondering what he could have done differently. He was particularly troubled by the realization that Emily had been suffering just a few hundred feet from where he conducted his daily security rounds, and that his failure to detect her presence earlier had allowed her ordeal to continue for months. As the investigation entered its fourth day, Emily was moved from the medical facility to a specialized residential treatment center that could provide the intensive care and therapy she needed. Her departure from the palace environment marked the end of one chapter in her story, but it was clear that her recovery would be a long and difficult process that would require the coordinated efforts of many dedicated professionals. The implications of Emily's case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. It raised fundamental questions about the palace's ability to protect the people within its walls, and its responsibility to the broader community it served. As these questions began to be asked by investigators, journalists, and the public, it became clear that the Emily incident would have consequences that reached far beyond the corridors where she had hidden for so many months. The fourth week following Emily's discovery marked a turning point in both the investigation and the broader implications for everyone involved. Detective Inspector Walsh had completed her preliminary findings and was preparing to forward criminal charges against Margaret Thornfield and several accomplices. The charges would include child endangerment, theft, fraud, and conspiracy to conceal evidence. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the combination of offenses meant that Margaret faced the possibility of spending the rest of her working life behind bars. Margaret's legal team, provided by the palace's insurance company due to her status as an employee acting within the scope of her duties, had initially attempted to negotiate a plea agreement that would focus on her good intentions rather than the harmful consequences of her actions. However, as more evidence emerged about the systematic nature of her deception and the severity of Emily's neglect, it became clear that such an approach would not be successful. The psychological evaluation of Margaret, conducted by Dr. Volkan Bine, Martin Ashworth, revealed a complex portrait of a woman who had convinced herself that she was saving Emily while simultaneously creating the conditions that harmed her.
Doctor!
Ashworth's report described Margaret as suffering from a form of delusional thinking that allowed her to rationalize increasingly harmful behavior as acts of love and protection. She genuinely believed that keeping Emily hidden in the palace was better than allowing her to enter the foster care system, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This psychological assessment became crucial to understanding how the situation had developed and continued for so long. Margaret was not a monster who had set out to harm a child, but rather someone whose flawed thinking and institutional position had created a perfect storm of neglect and abuse. Her case became a study in how good intentions could lead to terrible outcomes when combined with poor judgment and unchecked authority. Emily's recovery was proceeding slowly but steadily at the residential treatment center, where she was receiving round-the-clock care from specialists in childhood trauma. Dr. Rebecca Chen continued to work with Emily several times per week, helping her process her experiences and begin to develop healthier coping mechanisms. The therapy sessions revealed the depth of Emily's trauma and the extent to which her development had been affected by months of hiding and fear. One of the most challenging aspects of Emily's treatment was helping her understand that she was safe and that she no longer needed to hide or remain silent to protect herself. She had been so thoroughly conditioned to suppress her natural impulses that she struggled to express basic needs like hunger or discomfort. She would hoard food in her room, convinced that her next meal might not come, and she would wake up multiple times each night to check that her door was unlocked and that escape routes were available. The treatment team developed a comprehensive plan designed to address both Emily's immediate trauma and her long-term developmental needs. This included individual therapy to help her process her experiences, group activities with other children to help her develop social skills, and educational support to address the months of schooling she had missed. Medical treatment was also necessary to address the physical effects of malnutrition and to ensure that her growth and development were not permanently affected. Finding a permanent placement for Emily proved to be more complicated than initially expected. Her father remained in a rehabilitation facility and was in no condition to care for a child with Emily's complex needs. Margaret had been her only known relative with the resources to provide care, and that option was obviously no longer available. The social services team responsible for her case had to balance her need for stability with the reality that she would require specialized support for years to come. The palace's internal investigation, led by Commander Robert Hayes, had expanded beyond the immediate circumstances of Emily's case to examine broader systemic failures in security and oversight. Hayes had assembled a team of external consultants to conduct a comprehensive review of palace protocols and to recommend changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Their preliminary findings were sobering and pointed to fundamental flaws in how the institution monitored its own staff and maintained awareness of what was happening within its walls. The security review revealed that the palace's elaborate systems for protecting against external threats had created blind spots that could be exploited by internal actors. The focus on preventing unauthorized people from entering the building had led to insufficient attention to monitoring the movement and activities of authorized personnel. Staff members like Margaret had significant freedom to access different areas of the palace without oversight, and their activities were rarely questioned as long as they fulfilled their primary job responsibilities. The consultant team recommended a complete overhaul of internal security protocols, including enhanced background checks for all staff members, regular psychological evaluations for employees in sensitive positions, and improved systems for monitoring access to restricted areas. They also suggested the establishment of an independent oversight body with the authority to investigate concerns about staff behavior without interference from palace management. These recommendations met with significant resistance from some senior palace officials, who argued that implementing such measures would create an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that would be incompatible with the palace's traditional culture. They worried that excessive oversight would make it difficult to recruit and retain high-quality staff members who valued the discretion and autonomy that had always been hallmarks of palace employment. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell found himself caught between the need to demonstrate that the palace was taking the Emily incident seriously and the pressure to maintain the institutional culture that had served the monarchy for centuries. He understood that some changes were necessary, but he was concerned about overcorrecting in ways that might create new problems while failing to address the root causes of what had happened. The debate over security reforms reflected broader questions about the palace's role in modern society and its obligations to the people who worked within its walls. The incident had exposed the extent to which the institution's commitment to tradition and hierarchy had prevented it from adapting to contemporary standards for protecting vulnerable individuals. The question was whether meaningful change was possible within the existing structure or whether more fundamental reforms would be necessary. James Mitchell had become an unexpected focal point for these broader discussions. His decision to force open Margaret's door had been vindicated by subsequent events, but his willingness to prioritize Emily's welfare over institutional protocols had made some of his colleagues uncomfortable. He received both commendations and criticism for his actions, with some viewing him as a hero who had saved a child's life, and others seeing him as someone who had violated the trust and discretion that were essential to palace operations. The mixed reaction to James's actions revealed the institutional tensions that had contributed to Emily's situation in the first place. The palace culture that valued loyalty and discretion above all else had created an environment where staff members were reluctant to report concerns or challenge questionable behavior by their colleagues. The unwritten rules that governed palace life had made it easier for Margaret to maintain her conspiracy and harder for potential witnesses to speak up about their suspicions. James found himself questioning not only his role within the palace, but his understanding of what service and loyalty actually meant. He had always believed that his duty was to protect the institution and the people it represented. But the Emily incident had forced him to confront the possibility that those two obligations might sometimes conflict. He began to wonder whether true loyalty required challenging the institution when it failed to live up to its stated values, rather than simply following orders and maintaining silence. The media attention surrounding the Emily case was carefully managed by the palace's press office, but rumours and speculation continued to circulate in London newspapers and on social media platforms. The official line was that a personnel matter was being handled through appropriate channels and that the privacy of all individuals involved would be protected. However, journalists continued to investigate the story, and it was only a matter of time before more details became public. The pressure of media scrutiny added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Palace officials were torn between their desire to demonstrate transparency and accountability and their need to protect Emily's privacy and the ongoing legal proceedings. They also worried about the impact that negative publicity might have on the monarchy's reputation and its relationship with the British public. As the fourth week of the investigation drew to a close, it was clear that the Emily incident had become more than just a case of individual misconduct. It had exposed fundamental weaknesses in one of Britain's most important institutions and had raised questions that would not be easily answered. The decisions made in the coming weeks would determine not only the fate of the individuals directly involved, but also the future direction of an institution that had survived and adapted through centuries of social and political change. Emily herself remained largely unaware of the broader implications of her case. Her world had narrowed to the safe boundaries of the treatment centre, where caring professionals were helping her learn to trust adults again and to believe that she deserved protection and support. Her recovery would be the ultimate measure of whether the systems that had failed her so completely could be reformed enough to prevent similar tragedies in the future. 6 months after James Mitchell forced open that office door, the final chapter of the Emily incident was still being written in courtrooms, treatment centres, and the corridors of power, where decisions about institutional reform were being debated and implemented. The ripple effects of that March morning had spread far beyond what anyone could have anticipated, reshaping not only the lives of those directly involved, but also the very foundations of one of Britain's most enduring institutions. Margaret Thornfield's trial had concluded 2 weeks earlier with a guilty verdict on all charges. The judge, Justice Patricia Hawthorne, had delivered a sentencing decision that balanced Margaret's good intentions with the severity of her crimes. Margaret received a 4-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 2 years, along with a lifetime ban from working with children or vulnerable adults. In her sentencing remarks, Justice Hawthorne acknowledged Margaret's genuine care for Emily, while emphasising that good intentions could never excuse the systematic abuse and neglect that had resulted from her actions. The trial had been conducted under special procedures designed to protect Emily's privacy, but enough details had emerged to shock even experienced court observers. The prosecution's case had meticulously documented 8 months of systematic deception, theft, and child endangerment that had been enabled by institutional failures and cultural blind spots within the palace. Margaret's defense team had argued for leniency based on her previous good character and her belief that she was protecting Emily, but the evidence of harm was too extensive to ignore. Margaret's accomplices had received lesser sentences, with most receiving suspended sentences and community service requirements. Thomas Bradley, the kitchen worker, had been ordered to complete 200 hours of community service and attend counselling sessions about recognising and reporting signs of child abuse. Sandra Lewis and David Morrison received similar sentences, with additional requirements to undergo training about their responsibilities as mandatory reporters of suspected child maltreatment. The differential sentences reflected the court's recognition that Margaret had been the primary architect of the conspiracy, while her accomplices had been manipulated into participating through a combination of deception and misplaced loyalty. However, Justice Hawthorne had made clear that ignorance and good intentions were not sufficient defences for failing to protect a vulnerable child, and she had ordered all defendants to participate in educational programs designed to prevent similar failures in the future. Emily's placement in a permanent home had finally been resolved after months of careful planning and preparation. She had been placed with Sarah and Michael Crawford, an experienced foster family who specialised in caring for children with complex trauma histories. The Crawfords lived in a quiet suburb outside London, where Emily could attend a local school and receive continued therapy while learning to live as a normal child for the first time in her life. The transition had been gradual and carefully supervised, with Emily spending increasing amounts of time with the Crawford family over several months before moving in permanently. Dr. Boyne, Rebecca Chen continued to provide therapy support during this transition, helping Emily process her mixed feelings about leaving the treatment center that had become her safe haven and learning to trust another set of adults with her care. Emily's progress had been remarkable in many ways, but her recovery was far from complete. She had gained weight and grown several inches, bringing her physical development closer to normal ranges for her age. She had learned to read at grade level and had shown particular aptitude for mathematics and science subjects. Most importantly, she had begun to form healthy relationships with the adults and children in her life, though she still struggled with trust and abandonment issues that might affect her for years to come. The most encouraging sign of Emily's healing was her growing ability to advocate for herself and express her needs directly. She had learned to ask for help when she was frightened or confused, and she had developed the confidence to set boundaries when adults asked too much of her too quickly. These skills would serve her well as she continued to navigate the challenges of growing up with a traumatic past, while building hope for a healthier future. The palace reforms that had been recommended by the security review team were being implemented in phases, despite ongoing resistance from some traditionalists within the institution. Commander Robert Hayes had been promoted to deputy head of security and given responsibility for overseeing the modernization of internal monitoring systems. The reforms included mandatory training for all staff members about recognizing and reporting signs of abuse, enhanced background screening procedures for employees in sensitive positions, and the establishment of an anonymous reporting system for concerns about staff behavior. Perhaps most significantly, the palace had created the position of Independent Child Protection Officer, a role that would be filled by someone from outside the royal household, with the authority to investigate any concerns about the welfare of children who might be present on palace grounds. This position represented a fundamental shift in the palace's approach to oversight, acknowledging that some responsibilities were too important to be left entirely to internal management. The cultural changes within the palace were proving more difficult to implement than the structural reforms. Many long-serving staff members struggled to adapt to increased scrutiny and oversight after decades of operating with minimal supervision. Some resented the implication that they could not be trusted to police themselves, while others worried that the new atmosphere of suspicion would undermine the loyalty and discretion that had always been central to palace culture. James Mitchell had emerged from the incident with his reputation enhanced and his career prospects improved, but he had also gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of institutional loyalty and personal responsibility. He had been promoted to senior security officer and had been given additional responsibilities for staff training and internal security awareness. However, he remained troubled by questions about how many other problems might be hiding within the palace's walls and whether the reforms being implemented would be sufficient to prevent future tragedies. The public revelation of the Emily incident, which had finally become public knowledge during Margaret's trial, had generated intense media coverage and public debate about the monarchy's ability to govern itself effectively. The story had been covered extensively by British newspapers and had attracted international attention as an example of how even the most prestigious institutions could harbor serious problems beneath their polished exterior surfaces. Public reaction had been mixed, with some critics arguing that the incident demonstrated fundamental problems with the monarchy's secrecy and lack of accountability to democratic oversight. Others had praised the palace's ultimate response to the crisis and had argued that the reforms being implemented showed a genuine commitment to learning from past mistakes. The royal family's popularity had declined somewhat in opinion polls, but not to the extent that some observers had predicted. The broader implications of the Emily case had extended far beyond the palace walls to influence discussions about institutional child protection throughout British society. Social services agencies had reviewed their own procedures for monitoring children in unofficial care arrangements, and other large institutions had examined their internal oversight systems to identify potential vulnerabilities. Educational institutions, religious organizations, and corporate employers had all taken note of how the palace's culture of deference and discretion had enabled abuse to continue undetected for months. Many had initiated their own reviews and reforms to ensure that their emphasis on loyalty and confidentiality did not create conditions where vulnerable individuals could be harmed without detection or intervention. The Emily incident had also contributed to broader conversations about the balance between privacy and protection in institutional settings. The palace's traditional approach of handling problems internally and maintaining confidentiality had proven inadequate when dealing with serious criminal behavior and child welfare concerns. The challenge for the palace and similar institutions was finding ways to maintain appropriate discretion while ensuring that serious problems were addressed through proper channels. Dr. Bikering, Rebecca Chen had continued to study Emily's case as part of a broader research project about institutional trauma and recovery. Her preliminary findings suggested that children who experienced abuse in institutional settings faced unique challenges that required specialized treatment approaches. Emily's experience of being hidden and silenced had created particular difficulties with trust and self-advocacy that differed from trauma experienced in family or community settings. The research implications of Emily's case extended to understanding how institutional cultures could either support or undermine child protection efforts. Dr. Chen's work suggested that institutions with strong hierarchical structures and cultures of deference might be particularly vulnerable to enabling abuse, especially when potential witnesses were discouraged from questioning authority or reporting concerns through official channels. As Emily's story entered this new phase, with her living safely with the Crawford family and continuing her recovery with professional support, the broader lessons of her case continued to unfold. The palace had begun implementing reforms that would hopefully prevent similar tragedies in the future, but the ultimate test would be whether these changes would be sustained over time and whether they would be sufficient to address the cultural factors that had enabled Emily's situation to develop and persist. The guard who had chosen to listen to his instincts and force open a locked door had set in motion a chain of events that had ultimately led to justice for Emily and meaningful reforms within one of Britain's most important institutions. The price of that justice had been high for everyone involved, but the alternative, allowing Emily's suffering to continue in silence, would have been far worse. Emily herself remained largely focused on the immediate challenges and opportunities of her new life with the Crawford family. She was learning to ride a bicycle, developing friendships with children in her neighborhood, and discovering interests and talents that had been suppressed during her months of hiding. Her future remained uncertain in many ways, but for the first time since her mother's death, she had reasons to hope that tomorrow would be better than today. The Emily incident would continue to influence policies and practices within the palace and beyond for years to come, but its most important legacy was already clear. A child who had been invisible and voiceless had been seen and heard, and the institutions that had failed her had been forced to confront their shortcomings and commit to doing better. In the end, that might be the most fitting tribute to Emily's resilience and the most meaningful consequence of James Mitchell's decision to put compassion ahead of protocol on that March morning when he chose to force open a door and change everything.